Hi guys, Miss Ewing here. I thought I would switch it up and try this. If we all hate it, we won't do it again. But I figured we could try something different since this is going to be our life at least until May 4th. Yeah. Okay. So we are starting the American Industrial Revolution. This is a very interesting time in our history. We will get into why, but first, what is an industrial revolution? It's probably a term you've never heard before, right? Basically, think it like this. It's a movement from agricultural based economies. So a lot of farming, producing corn, wheat, very local. You're not really trading a lot. You're doing a lot of local growing and bartering with smaller other farmers, right? Towards a mercantilism. So it's this idea of trading and selling manufactured goods. So we see the birth of a factory, which is very different. Factories are exactly what industrial means. Industrial means factory, factory means industrial. So we see the birth of a lot of factories, but we see a large growth in one particular part of the economy, and I'll explain what that is later. Usually, the industrial revolutions happen because people have access to a lot of food. There's an overabundance of food, and we don't need a lot of farmers. And because of that, you see a movement towards people kind of traveling to the city. And so we see these emergence of these big metropolitan areas that we know now as like cities of New York City, Chicago. Like we see a bunch of people move towards Chicago, which births this smaller farming community on the outside to support this city, but we see a birth of, the importance of wheat, while in Chicago, they're packing meat and shipping things off. So we see this kind of birth of cities, but also the blend of rural communities and cities working together. Um, that's kind of why it happens. So when exactly does it start? Now, looking back, the European Industrial Revolution starts much, much earlier than the American Industrial Revolution. And you have to think because the European nations were older, they had been around longer, they had moved past a lot of things. Whereas Americans were these pioneers of, this new world, this new colony in North America with no factories, no predetermined, um, crops there. There were no farmers around. There wasn't all this stuff. They had to start from scratch. So America is going to enter the Industrial Revolution a little later, and that's fine. So the American Industrial Revolution is said to have started in Rhode Island in 1793 when Samuel Slater built the first American, and I put a star there because it's not the first spinning mill. It's just the first American spinning mill. And you have to think of a spinning mill as like picture a large building, right? And have you ever seen those wheels that run water through them? They like move in a circular motion and the water trickles down to kind of keep moving it in that circular motion. Well, that's a mill. And mills generate energy, and energy allows for you to power things. So we see Samuel Slater build the first spinning mill, which allows for him to build a factory that makes cloth, not clothes, but cloth. We were able to start making all these cloths, which then allows for us to ship them off to be made into clothes. But we see this large burst in a need for factories in what's called the textile industry, which I explained in another slide. But it doesn't really take off though until about right after the war and during the War of 1812. And that's largely because before the War of 1812, we're still trading with Great Britain, which means we have access to a lot of imported goods. Well, when the Americans enter the War of 1812, we lose a lot of those imported goods, those purchased textiles, any types of goods that we're getting from Europe that we haven't quite figured out how to manufacture as a very young country. Okay. So Americans realize we have to start creating a new way to get these goods because British ships are cutting off our access to trade with France, Italy, Spain, Portugal, all of these places in Europe. So they basically become a pain in our side. And we have to create new ways to get the same goods they've used their whole life. So by 1814, the most famous factory was a textile cloth factory mill that was created by a rich man by the name of Francis Cabot Lowell and employed a lot of young ladies. Now that sounds creepy. I know. Trust me. Just look at him. He kind of looks creepy. Um, Not that this is to like degrade or to say anything bad about it. This picture, it's the only picture I could really find. It kind of paints Lowell in, he kind of looks African American in this photo. I don't know exactly why, but he is very much a white man. And you have to keep in mind this is very much with the times. And I'm not promoting that white people should be, the only people who do business. I'm just pointing out that this photo kind of depicts him to look differently than what he actually is. But anyways, that handlebar mustache kind of makes you think like, it looks kind of creepy. That's probably why he employed a bunch of young ladies. Actually, that's not it. Young ladies are probably the most available um, for labor at this time. You have to think men are working on farms or become the sole breadwinners of families and cannot afford to join this new factory style of work. Okay, so because of that, women are probably the most disposable, unused people to be working in these factories. So he starts asking women probably from ages of 15 to 20, only because around 20 is when they start marrying, and once they marry, they no longer can work there. It's very complicated. Um, he starts hiring all these women, and it really blows up. And he basically creates a whole city in Massachusetts, Lowell, Massachusetts, for his company because he would basically kind of convince them to come to his factory. He would put them in a room and board. They would make all this money, and families needed that. It also gave women an early start to their life. They brought something to the marriage. They had their own income, which was huge. The Lowell girls actually were paid quite well, but they worked awful hours though, long, grueling days. Um, this is pretty standard with early industrial movements of factories. Usually, there's not a whole lot of like standards of hourly work days. It's actually quite shocking they were paid well, considering as we move into the latter half of the 1800s, we see a lot of issues with fair pay, terrible hours, unsafe working conditions, things like that. So we're going to move on from this. So basically, I've talked about is factories, right? Well, things have to happen for factories to really blow up, for us to hit that industrial wave, right? So this time period is actually a time of innovation and new technologies emerged that created a better life for Americans. So we see a lot of very important inventions come out of this time. So if you can see my mouse right here, which I believe you can, this right here is called the cotton gin, which I'll explain what it does. We've got the telegraph down here, and we've got this man right here who invents the steam powered engine, which allows us to have the steam locomotive, the steamboats, and things like that. There are also a lot more inventions, but I am condensing down to some of the more important ones just because you don't need to know 50,000 different inventions. That would be boring for you. So I just wanted to make sure that we covered the important stuff. So the first thing, the telegraph. I don't want to start with the cotton gin because there's a lot of stuff tied to it. So we're going to move into the telegraph first. Okay. Everyone loves their cell phone, right? Everyone. I mean, I use mine daily. I know for a fact that more than half of you watch TikTok all day, even before all this happened, because you sat there and did the renegade in my classroom all the time. Well, you love those things, right? Well, without an early invention by Samuel F.B. Morse in 1837, this might not have been possible. He invents something called Morse code. If any of you have family members that watch like older war movies, it makes like a tapping sound. It's like a tap, 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 pause, tap, tap, pause, tap, 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 right? Well, those taps are short pulses of energy along a wire that were translated into letters. Oh, that sent out messages. I'm missing a word there. That sent out messages. Basically, they're just really, really complicated text messages. Someone would have to translate these messages into what's called a telegram, which would then be delivered to whoever it was meant to. before. It wasn't like you just sat there and tapped back and forth to each other. It was kind of a long process, but it was the introduction of the idea that you didn't have to mail something to someone. It's a cool idea, right? Great. And the next thing is the steam powered engine. So this is a super long definition, so follow along and I'll promise I'll explain it. A steam engine is a heat engine that performs mechanical work using steam as its working fluid. The steam engine uses the force produced by the steam pressure to push a piston back and forth inside a cylinder. This pushing force is transformed by a connecting rod and a flywheel into a rotational force for work. Now, that's super long, kind of boring. I'm pretty sure none of you understood. But what it's referring to is this nice little image right on to your right of your screen, okay? So this is a very crappy diagram. I'm sorry. But basically, you heat up water, it creates steam, right? You boil a pot of water for your mac and cheese, that stuff that comes up from the pot is called steam. If you didn't know that, fun fact. Okay? That is a very energetic form of water, and it has a lot of pressure. And when you push it into a small confined space, it creates a pressure that moves things, right? So this part right here, so here's where the steam enters, it comes to this part, which is a piston, okay? And as it moves the piston forward and backward using the pressure, it moves this flywheel, which generates energy, right? This is the process of how we created engines for early types of, technology. This is big because three things come from it, okay? The first, it doesn't really go in order. It kind of goes super backwards, but it's fine. The very first one I talk about is Robert Fulton perfects this engine to be used in a steamboat in 1807, which basically allowed for people to travel along rivers in a quicker and controlled manner. So before this, you used to have to basically get in the boat, and let's say the Ohio River only runs. I'm not going to use that one because it's weird. But the Mississippi River, let's say it only runs south. So the fastest way to get to where you're going is to take a boat from your most northern point down to wherever you're trying to get to on a southern point. The problem is the flow doesn't go the opposite direction. And we don't really have a lot of technology to push the boat to go the opposite direction of natural waterways. So what you would have to do is basically take a boat down and then find a way back up, either A, by some type of rowboat or coal powered boat. I'm not really sure exactly what it was before this, but it was very hard to get back. Okay. You would usually have to go back by land, and that's super not cool for anybody who came down on a freaking boat. Okay. So this allows for people to go down to their destination, get what they need to, maybe transport goods, and then restart the process. Now, I know that sounds kind of weird, like, Miss Ewing, how do they get to the boat to the most northern point to the southern point? I don't know before that, but now we can move them back and forth, and it's cheaper, okay? The next, sorry, I'm getting text messages. I have friends, shocker. The next thing is Peter Cooper invents the steam locomotive in 1830. This allows for people to travel across the United States from anywhere there was a railroad. So before this, you had to get your little horse and your buggy, and you rode it across the country. It takes a really long time. Now, I'm not talking these trains are moving at like a supersonic speed or anything, but it's much quicker than your horse and buggy. You don't have to stop. You don't have to feed it. Okay, it's not like you have to feed a train. It's pretty self-explanatory. So it allows for transcontinental travel. Okay, so that means I can take a train from Maine. Eventually, this is how big locomotives become and the railroad expands. I can take a train all the way from Maine to California, which was never done before. So this is a super revolutionary type of product, right? The last thing is the introduction of steam-powered engines in 1780 allows for factories to exist anywhere, not just next to rivers for mills. Before, factories were powered by mills near factories. Now, if you can create steam, which usually they would burn coal to generate steam from water, super fun process, super clean, to generate that engine power, right? You could do it from anywhere. This is huge. It means places like Chicago can have these massive cities. even if they're not right on the river, because there is a river in Chicago. Or, you don't have to build a factory on the Hudson River in New York City, which there is not a lot of access to the Hudson River if you don't know that. It basically allows for big cities to happen anywhere. You don't have to be on a waterway. It does make it easier for transportation of goods, but with the locomotive taking off, aka a train, this becomes easier to have cities and towns kind of grow anywhere. So the steam powered engine is pretty important. So looking at these pictures, the top right here is the original steam locomotive. Kind of looks like a little dinky little thing, right? Doesn't look super cool. Doesn't look like it can hold a lot of things. It kind of looks lame, right? Well, all prototypes are lame, and eventually we get something cool. I mean, imagine what the first iPhone looked like. If you guys weren't around, you guys didn't really know, but the iPhone 3 was like this big clunky looking thing, and it was not fast. Pictures look like basically like the worst camera in the world. It pixelated. It basically everybody looked like you did in what is this, Minecraft. Okay, everybody just looked like big chunky characters. Okay, I'm kidding, but anyways, so a prototype of this is gonna look very different. Over time, it becomes this image on the right. We get this awesome creation of these massive trains that can carry goods, people across all terrains. It's huge. Okay. On the bottom, we have the first steam powered engine steamboat. That's what I meant to say. Steamboat. It's called the Clermont. Okay. Can't really transport a lot of people. It's quite small, very limited, right? But eventually we get what's on the right. Okay. We get these large, massive ships that can carry multitudes of people. You can go on a steamboat trip now. They're like all the rage in the South on the Mississippi and near like Louisiana and stuff. Um, so they're pretty, they become a quintessential type of travel along rivers. And they're still used today just because the steamboats that we, not steamboats, but those large liners and boats that we use just don't really fit well in riverbeds where steamboats do. So although they start small, they become these huge things. So next we get the cotton gin, okay? And you watched a video on that. I hope you watched the video on that. I am realistic and know that often you guys don't do what I tell you to do. But alas, this particular invention was a blessing and a curse, depending on who you were and what side of the invention you kind of existed on, right? So before textile factories became a priority, we need to go back a little bit to understand why the cotton gin is so revolutionary. Before textile factories became a priority, many Southern farmers grew tobacco, which we know basically saved the Virginian colonies. But that crop was heavily labor intensive and wasn't as lucrative as it used to be, especially when the Europeans basically tell us to go kick rocks. Okay. Um, so people started to move away from tobacco, but they hadn't figured out a replacement. So at first, cotton was not considered a replacement. If you don't know much about cotton, it's not really hard to grow in the South. It's actually very easy to grow. I don't know why I put hard to grow, but it's even harder to harvest. So if you look at the pictures on the right, you see these lovely little cotton balls, right? When you pick cotton, first of all, it's very I don't from what I've read, I've never actually done it. They're very pokey. They hurt. Okay, they aren't fun to pick. So generally, you kind of pick slower. Okay, but then on top of it, those little no little corns, little cotton balls have little seeds in them, little seed fibers, which makes the cotton rough. You have to filter out the seeds to make it that soft blend of material. So that process of picking out seeds is very slow. And nobody, not a single business person, no greedy person in the world likes slowing down profits. So cotton wasn't a very good alternative because if tobacco was hard to grow and make profits off of it this time, you needed double the amount of slaves, double the amount of labor to produce half as much as you needed to make a profit. Okay. So it wasn't really a realistic crop. Well, Eli Whitney sees this issue and figures out a way to separate the cotton from the seeds using a machine he invented called the cotton gin. Fun fact, the cotton gin was made from interchangeable parts actually used to create muskets. So that's kind of cool. But anyways, basically you put the cotton in on one side. So I want to say you insert it on this side and you feed the cotton through and you spin this little mechanism. And as it does it, it shreds the cotton open and separates the seeds through the bottom. So it collects the seeds for you, but also basically spreads the cotton out to make it into the little cotton fibers you need for it to be woven into textile. Um, this basically cuts down the time needed into fractions of the time it took. Manpower, just basic manpower. So you would think this, in theory, should cut down the need for slaves, right? Unfortunately, this would be almost the exact opposite. Basically, this creates a mass push for southern plantation owners to change crops. Cotton becomes a basically like the end all be all crop to grow in the South, especially the deep South. You didn't make money if you didn't sell cotton. Cotton was white gold, okay? Basically in the South. So a lot of these farmers, these plantation owners, not farmers, the 3% of people that were plantation owners that basically owned a large chunk of the land in the South changes crops. And this is both good and bad. And I'll explain why it's bad here in a minute. So they focused their whole production on feeding enough cotton to the north to sell this mass-made cotton goods to the European nations because we basically take over the textile industry. America becomes the single leader in the production of textiles. And that's a whole nother lesson for a whole nother day, but of the whole thing. Because of this, this further increases the needs for slaves. Is although you don't need as many people to sift through the cotton to pick out the seeds, you still need a ton because you're producing massive amount of cotton to pick the cotton, to run the cotton gins, to move the cotton, to move the product. So this only increases the need for slaves. So although this invention revolutionized the textile industry, by the way, that's Eli Whitney with the saggy right eye, textile industry, which basically helped launch the U.S. economy into a global scale. So before this, America was very focused on selling to Americans. We were not someone that people looked to buy goods from other than like wood. We had a ton of wood, okay? And basically the frontier of the western half of the hemisphere, okay? And so we weren't useful for anything. Well, when we revolutionized this textile industry, we become the nation to trade with for cloth, all sorts of things. So this is a good part of it, but the bad part is it increases the need for slave labor that was almost kind of becoming unnecessary in the South because they couldn't find a crop to replace that tobacco cash earning crop. So there's a lot of consequences in the South for a particular group of people um, from the Industrial Revolution. And by 1880, 1808, the international slave trade was abolished. We talked about this. Um, when they wrote the Constitution, some of the things that they had written in was that the international slave trade was done. We could not buy slaves from other countries anymore. But this only further pushes the domestic slave trade. So although we're no longer buying slaves from other countries, basically what's happening is plantation owners are forcing that creation of more slaves because if you can feed that slave enough and that slave enough, you can make another slave. Okay. So it now becomes less costly. And in fact, you can make more money by keeping your slave labor just enough fed so that you can sell their children later. It's a very sad aspect of the slave trade. Not slave trade, but of slavery as a whole. Um, so because of this, this domestic slave trade basically takes off because of the lack of incoming slaves. Because unfortunately, the way that they are treated, slaves often don't have a long lifespan. So you have to replace your slave labor. So by the early parts of the 1800s, almost every slave in the U.S. had been born into slavery. Okay, and I'm not talking about 1809. I'm talking about like the 1830s to about 1849. Okay, because then you enter the latter half at 1850s, and that's when we start talking about Civil War. Um, Most of the slaves were no longer Africans. I mean, there was probably here a trickle here and there that survived against all odds, but most were born into this. They'd never known a life outside of this. Now, here's kind of something, I guess, interesting to think about. In the early parts of the 1800s, slavery was bad, but it wasn't the worst it would get. Slavery changes because of a large rebellion led by slaves in Virginia. It's a good thing it happens because we get to see like this aspect of slavery that I wish wouldn't have happened, but it becomes the push for the abolishment of slavery as a whole. So although it's a terrible consequence of the Industrial Revolution, the first Industrial Revolution, we do see something that might be good that comes out of it, I guess, if you want to use the word good. Okay, so Nat Turner is a famous early slave rebel. He's one of the most famous. And he led a violent uprising in 1831 in Virginia. So, some things that you need to understand. Turner was an educated slave. It means he could read and write, which we've always been taught that slaves can't read or write. Now, not every slave owner is teaching their slaves to read and write, but it wasn't uncommon that slaves knew how to read and write. He was able to rally enough men from other plantations to begin this gruesome uprising, and I'll explain why it's gruesome in a minute. But being able to have multiple slaves communicating back and forth from other plantations is mildly dangerous when you're trying to oppress a group of people. You don't want them to be able to read and write. You don't want them to have secret communications. So when this happens, Nat Turner's rebellion results in a lot of harsh laws against slaves in the South. The return of slaves, we have slave like bounty hunters. It becomes illegal to teach slaves to read and write, and punishments become huge. They become more violent and deadly, which is sad, so sad. By gruesome, I mean Nat Turner basically kills his whole slave owning family, down to from the owner all the way down to the baby. So there was no one got left out from it. Um, it really paints a bad view on what it's to, for uprisings for slaves. But you have to think that a group of people being oppressed so long, you're bound to get a violent uprising as a result of slaves. Um, Nat Turner is caught and killed. He's hanged for his crimes. I use the right word. It is hanged. Don't correct me. He basically hides out for 2 months, and then finally, bounty hunters find him. They hang him. There's a lot more with that. You're welcome to look it up, but you guys are very young for me to discuss some of it, so I wouldn't necessarily advise it until you're a little older to look up some of the facts about Nat Turner's rebellion. The result of Nat Turner's rebellion is the birth of slavery that we know: whipping, lashing, starving, abusing, and torturing of African Americans that has become so the infamous face of American slavery. You look here, this man has harsh scars from whippings, um, basically leather smacking on your skin at fast rate actually breaks open the skin and exposing the muscle. Do it over time, you develop what's called scar tissue. And that's what these thick scars are on the back. Obviously, if you scrape your knee bad enough, you get a little scar. Well, imagine it over and over again in the same spot. You're eventually going to develop a very thick, bubbly looking patch of skin that scars over, creating scar tissue. Image to the right is obviously a family. They're really well dressed. Not all slaves are going to be dressed that way. But that's kind of what the whole family picked all the way down from the baby. As soon as they could walk and basically take care of themselves, they become labor that needs to work. Okay. And you worked all day until they said stop. The man in the bottom right corner is Nat Turner. We don't really have a lot of images from a lot of slavery that I can get into. You just keep in mind, nobody really wants to admit that their former ancestors are slave owners. So there's a lot of probably, historical stuff that we'll never see. But that is the end of my slideshow. answer the questions, but please let me know how you guys felt about this type of lecture at the bottom. If you liked it, if you didn't like it, I might upload both or just one, depending on how you guys feel about it. See you guys when I see you again. Oh man, I should have pressed stop first.